Ever feel like when you're trying to understand land ownership, like especially somewhere as historically, I don't know, rich as the Philippines, it's like you're navigating a jungle of legal jargon.
It really can be, yeah.
Well, think of this as your machete, okay? We're doing a deep dive today, going way deep into your stack of documents. We're talking legal cases, historical records, all that good stuff to help clear a path through this very complex landscape.
And it is a fascinating landscape when you really get into it, full of twists and turns. And, you've got these ancient traditions that are like blending with Spanish colonial influences and then like modern legal frameworks. It's no wonder figuring out like who owns what can get a little complicated.
So true. Okay, so let's jump right into it. One of the first things that kind of jumped out from these documents was the question of foreigners and whether they can even own land in the Philippines. I mean, is that even possible?
So it's one of those like it depends situations. The 1987 Constitution, which is essentially the rule book for the country, generally says no.
Hmm.
Like foreigners owning land is a no-go. And I think that reflects a strong sense of, national pride, wanting
Yeah.
to keep that land, in Filipino hands. But, and this is where it gets interesting, there are exceptions.
Exceptions. Ooh, I love a good legal loophole. Okay, so what are we talking about here?
Imagine like inheriting a piece of paradise in the Philippines.
Okay, yeah,
It sounds pretty idyllic, right? Like a little slice of heaven.
right.
Well, it turns out if a foreigner inherits land from a Filipino citizen, they can actually own it. There might be some specific conditions, some legal hoops to jump through, but it is possible.
Interesting.
And here's another one that might surprise you. Foreign governments, they can own land too.
Wait, hold up. Are we talking about some, like, ultra exclusive resort for diplomats only? Is that where my tax dollars are going?
Haha. No, 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 not quite. It's really just for practical stuff,
Yeah.
embassies, diplomatic missions, that sort of thing. Makes sense when you think about it, right? I
Yeah.
mean, they got to have a place for all those international powwows.
Right, right. Okay, that makes sense. So it's not just about who you are, but also about the land's purpose.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, interesting. Now, these documents keep mentioning something called alienable and disposable land. Honestly, that sounds like something out of like a fantasy novel to me. What's the deal with that term?
I know, right? It does sound like legal jargon, but it's actually really crucial for understanding land ownership in the Philippines. So it all boils down to this thing called the Regalian Doctrine,
Okay.
which is a principle that, dates way back to the Spanish colonial era. And basically what it says is that the state, meaning the government, owns all the land, unless it specifically says otherwise.
So, for someone who's looking at buying a piece of property,
Yeah.
this means checking if that plot of land has already been classified as alienable and disposable, right?
Yes, exactly.
Otherwise, they might be walking into a legal nightmare.
Exactly. You need to have that clear positive act from the government, like a proclamation or an executive order. It's like getting the government's official stamp of approval saying, yep, this land is no longer needed for public use. You're good to go. You can own it privately.
It's a safeguard then to
Yes,
prevent a few select people from controlling all the good stuff.
exactly. Exactly.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Now, speaking of safeguards, these documents also mention the Torrens system a lot. And that sounds like kind of a big deal.
It is a big deal. The best way to think about it is like a fortress, right? Like it's a fortress protecting your land ownership rights. Basically, the Torrens system, it creates a public registry, so like a giant book where all the land ownership is recorded. And once your name is on that title, it's like having this ultimate proof of ownership, It makes it very difficult for someone to just come in and try to challenge your claim.
Oh, wow. That's reassuring.
Yes, very much so.
But are there ever any cases where even a Torrens title isn't enough?
Unfortunately, yes. As good as the Torrens system is, and it is designed to be pretty ironclad, there are always exceptions. There are always going to be those unusual cases. So things like fraud, for example, or errors on the title itself, or even like conflicting claims that date back years and years, sometimes even generations. Sadly, land ownership disputes are more common than you think.
Oh, yeah, I can only imagine. Like, all the family dramas, the neighborly feuds that must have played out over the years just because of property lines and
Oh, absolutely.
disagreements. Speaking of legal battles, that kind of ties into the importance of understanding legal remedies, right?
Yeah.
And these documents, they mention several: reconveyance, quiet title actions, even something called latches. What in the world is latches? That sounds more like a fancy coffee order than a legal term.
Right. Sadly, it's not as delightful as like a caramel macchiato, unfortunately.
Darn.
Latches basically boils down to use it or lose it. You know, it's like if you know you have a claim to a property, but you wait too long to do anything about it, well, you might be out of luck.
So if your neighbor decides to build, like, I don't know, a chicken coop that's technically on your property, don't just grumble about it for years and years.
Exactly.
Take action. Or a court might decide that you've basically, forfeited your right to even complain.
Yep, that's exactly right.
Wow. Okay. But going back to those other legal remedies, like, what's the difference between reconveyance and a quiet title action? I mean, they both sound like ways to reclaim what's rightfully yours.
Yeah, you're right to highlight those too, because they are, they're like having different tools in your legal toolbox,
Right.
and they each have their specific purpose. So reconveyance, that's usually used when like a property has been mistakenly registered under someone else's name.
Okay.
Whereas a quiet title action, that's more about clearing up any doubts, any uncertainties about a title.
Gotcha. So let's say you've got this like family heirloom, a piece of land that's been passed down through generations, but there's some like ancient document or some, long lost relative somewhere that's muddying the waters a bit.
Yeah.
A quiet title action could help solidify your claim.
Yeah, exactly. It's all about like putting those doubts to rest, making sure that you have that clear, undisputed ownership.
I like it. Okay, so we've been talking about like legal remedies, the Torrens system, all this stuff. Makes you wonder, how did this whole system even come to be? And I know from the documents that a lot of it traces back to the American colonial era. So what did the Americans bring to the table in terms of ideas about land ownership in the Philippines?
Yeah, it's a great question. The American period was definitely a turning point. They introduced this whole idea of public lands being a source of wealth,
Hmm.
and not just for the government, but also for citizens, both Filipino and American.
Interesting.
Yeah, so they allowed for the exploration and even exploitation of minerals. They were even granting patents for private mineral lands.
Hold on. Are we saying that someone could like own a piece of land and all the gold or silver or whatever riches happen to be underneath it?
That's exactly right. It was a huge departure from like the Spanish viewpoint, where mineral rights were considered separate from land ownership.
Oh, I bet that caused some legal headaches.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
You got these two sets of rules basically overlapping on the same piece of land.
Yeah.
It created some really fascinating legal precedents that we still see echoes of today.
Yeah, like two different games being played on the same field, like you were saying earlier.
Exactly, exactly. And then, of course, the 1987 Constitution came along.
Yeah.
And it really tried to strike a balance, right? So it limited land ownership to Filipino citizens and corporations that had at least 60% Filipino ownership. But at the same time, it also recognized the need for economic development for foreign investment.
Right, that balancing act again.
Yes.
Protecting national interests, but also encouraging growth, progress. And it seems like from the documents, even today, the government still keeps a pretty tight grip on the survey and classification of public lands, right?
Oh, absolutely. You've got the Bureau of Lands, and they pretty much have the final say on, which lands are suitable for private ownership, how those lands should be used.
So even if a piece of land has been designated as alienable and disposable, it doesn't automatically mean that just anyone can waltz in and claim it for themselves.
That's exactly right.
There's more to it than that.
It's just the first hurdle.
Yeah.
You've got a whole other obstacle course to navigate to prove that you meet all the requirements under the Public Land Act.
Which are there for a reason, I imagine,
Absolutely.
to prevent those with, power and money from grabbing up all the land.
Exactly. It's about ensuring fair access to land for all Filipinos. And this is especially true when it comes to agricultural land, which is considered, vital for the nation's well-being.
Right, of course. Speaking of agricultural land, the documents also, they go into like all the different types of land patents. You've got homestead patents, free patents, sales patents. It's a lot. So break it down for me. What's the deal with all these different patents?
Okay, so think of it this way. Each patent, it kind of serves a specific purpose, right? And it comes with its own set of requirements. It's like choosing the right tool for the job. So homestead patents, for instance, those are perfect for individuals, right? People who are willing to put in the time, the effort.
It's like a test of commitment.
Yes,
Like you're not just in it for a quick profit. You're putting down roots, literally.
Exactly, exactly. And then you've got free patents. And these are granted to Filipinos who have been occupying and cultivating a piece of land for at least 20 years.
Wow. So if you've been taking care of a piece of land, showing that you're a responsible steward for decades,
Right.
The government's like, you know what? You've earned this. It's officially yours.
Exactly. It's a way to like formalize
Yeah,
those existing claims and, provide that security of tenure.
that makes sense. Okay.
And then finally, you've got sales patents, which allow Filipinos to actually purchase alienable and disposable land directly from the government.
Okay, so it sounds like there's a pathway for almost anyone, really, depending on your circumstances and, of course, your goals for the land. But I imagine even with these patents, there are still, like, some strings attached, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. There are often restrictions on like selling or transferring the land,
Hmm.
within a specific time frame. So that might be 5 years. It could be 25 years, depending on the specific patent.
Oh, wow. Okay, so you can't just, like, flip it for a quick profit. It's really about encouraging that, like, responsible long-term ownership, right?
Exactly. Exactly. It's all about preventing speculation and making sure that the land is actually being used for its intended purpose.
Which makes a lot of sense. Now, we've been talking a lot about land that is, available for private ownership, but of course it's important to note that not all lands are up for grabs, right?
Right, of course. You can't forget about protecting those natural wonders, those beautiful landscapes,
Oh, yeah.
forest lands, national parks. All of that is considered part of the public domain. It's off limits for private ownership.
Got it. But even with those lands clearly defined, I imagine there are still bound to be some disputes, right?
Oh, absolutely.
People are people.
Exactly. And that's where things get even more interesting, I think, because now we're not just talking about legal frameworks, right?
Yeah.
We're talking about cultural sensitivities, historical claims, generational ties to the land.
It's like we've been talking about all the rules of the game.
Right.
But now we're realizing there are all these layers, like historical context, cultural influences that add this whole other level of complexity.
Yeah, absolutely.
So how does the Philippines, with its unique blend of history and, legal frameworks, how does it actually handle those inevitable land disputes that come up?
Well, they've got a system that really tries to blend fairness, making sure everyone's rights are respected, with efficiency. So it's like a combination of like administrative processes and then, if you need to, going to court.
Okay, so it's like trying to find a compromise, a peaceful resolution before things get like way too heated, way too official.
Exactly. Like, let's try to work this out, amicably, if at all possible.
Makes sense.
And the Department of Environment and Natural Resources, or DENR for
Okay.
short,
Yeah.
they actually play a big role here. So they handle a lot of these like land issues. So we're talking conflicting claims, disagreements over how land is classified, things like that.
Gotcha.
And going through DNR, it can be a lot faster, a lot less expensive than, lawyering up and heading straight to court.
Oh, for sure. Especially given the emotional toll, that these kinds of disputes can have on people. Finding a quicker resolution just makes sense, like for everyone involved.
Absolutely.
But if those attempts at compromise, if they just totally fail, then you've got the courts as that last resort, right?
Exactly. And, the legal actions that get used, they can be pretty specific. We're talking reconveyance, quiet title actions, petitions for review, all those terms we've been like unpacking. And of course, who can forget latches, right?
Oh, yeah, latches.
That's the legal equivalent of like hitting the snooze button one too many times.
Right.
But there's another layer here that I think is really fascinating, and that's the whole concept of ancestral domain claims.
Yes. The documents mention these. This is where the rights of indigenous communities, their rights to their ancestral lands, this is where it all comes into play, right?
Exactly.
And that just seems like such a, I don't know, delicate balance to strike. Like you're trying to respect those long-held traditions, but also you have to apply those modern legal frameworks, right?
Right. It's a real balancing act for sure.
Yeah.
And the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, which was passed in 1997, that was a huge moment. It basically recognizes that collective ownership that Indigenous communities have over their ancestral lands, and it gives them a way to actually have those lands officially recognized.
It's like saying, we see you, we recognize your deep connection to this land, and we're going to protect that.
Yes, exactly. It's a really important step.
But I imagine that these ancestral domain claims, they probably sometimes clash with other claims, right?
Yeah. Unfortunately, it does happen.
Leading to even more, I don't know, even more complicated legal battles.
Yes, it's true. You might have mining interests, development projects, or even just individual landowners whose claims overlap with these ancestral domains. And it really requires a lot of sensitivity, understanding of both like customary law and these modern legal principles, and really just a willingness to find solutions that respect everyone's rights.
Right. It's a good reminder that land isn't just about, Property lines on a map, legal documents. It's about people's lives, their histories, their identities. And speaking of different ways to own land, the documents also touched on condominiums.
Oh, right.
And I
Yes.
know it seems kind of straightforward at first, right? Like you buy an
Yeah.
apartment, you own it, end of story. But there's actually a lot more to it than that in the Philippines, isn't there?
There is. Yeah. Condominiums in the Philippines, they've got their own set of rules, which are actually outlined in the Condominium Act. And it really comes down to the fact that it's not just about owning the space, within your four walls. It's about sharing ownership of those common areas,
Hmm.
being part of that larger community.
So it's like its own little mini society, kind of.
Yeah, exactly. And it has its own, like, unique set of laws and responsibilities.
Interesting.
Yeah, so each building has a condominium corporation,
Yeah.
and they're responsible for managing the common areas, making decisions about, like, maintenance, upkeep, even handling disputes that might arise between residents.
Oh, wow.
And as a unit owner, you automatically become a member of that corporation.
Hmm.
So it's a whole different way of thinking about property ownership.
Yeah, it definitely is. It sounds like a crash course in like cooperation and community building.
It definitely can be.
Yeah.
And like with any form of land ownership in the Philippines, clear documentation is key, right?
Right.
And the documents you shared, they really highlighted the importance of properly registering and transferring condominium units, just to avoid those legal headaches down the line.
Always a good idea.
Oh,
Well, there you have it. We did it. We journeyed through the ins and outs of land ownership in the Philippines. We talked about everything from like ancient doctrines to modern day disputes, individual claims, communal ownership. It's been a journey.
it really has. We explored the legal framework, uncovered those historical influences, and even got into some of those cultural nuances that really make land ownership in the Philippines so unique.
We did, and we had some fun along the way. So, for anyone listening, remember that this deep dive has really just been a crash course. It's a jumping off point. It's your turn to kind of start exploring. If there's one thing we hope you take away from all of this, it's the importance of really doing your research, seeking out expert advice when you need it, and always, always remembering that deep connection between the land and the people, especially in a place as historically and culturally rich as the Philippines.
That's right. And never underestimate the power of asking questions.
So true. The more you know, the better.
Exactly. The more you know about the ins and outs of land ownership in the Philippines, the better equipped you'll be to navigate this, complex, often fascinating landscape.
Well said. So, as you continue to explore those documents, remember, knowledge is power, especially when it comes to land ownership in the Philippines. Happy exploring, everyone.